He should have died. Every medical calculation, every structural assessment of the suit's damaged systems, every rational reading of what that moment cost him, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. Darth Vader should have died on the floor of the Death Star's throne room, with his son kneeling beside him and the reactor fire fading in the shaft below. He didn't. The suit was catastrophically damaged. 3 primary life support relays had burned out completely from the Force lightning. His lungs, what remained of them, were working at a fraction of their already limited capacity. Moving was agony. Breathing was worse. But Anakin Skywalker had survived things that should have killed him his entire life. One more time was simply what he did. He reached the hangar on instinct alone, found an Imperial shuttle with enough residual power to break atmosphere, programmed the navicomputer with hands that could barely close around the controls, and punched into hyperspace before the Death Star finished its final countdown behind him. He didn't have a destination, just a direction. Away from Endor, away from the explosion, away from everything that had just ended. The navicomputer, running on emergency protocols, began scanning for the nearest Imperial-aligned coordinates. What it found instead was something that had no business being in any standard navigation database. A signal. Ancient. Layered beneath 17 levels of Sith encryption that the Imperial computer should not have been able to read at all. But Vader's suit, rebuilt and modified over 2 decades by Imperial engineers working directly from Palpatine's personal specifications, carried decryption architecture that had never been explained to its wearer. Palpatine had always planned for contingencies. The coordinates resolved slowly on the damaged screen. A planet with no name in any public record. A system charted only as a gravitational anomaly in the outer rim. And beneath the coordinates, a single line of ancient Sith text that the suit's systems translated without hesitation. The throne of the Sith. The fleet that waits. The power that does not end. Vader sat in the damaged shuttle for a long time, breathing through a suit that was barely keeping him alive, staring at coordinates that Palpatine had hidden from him for their entire time together. Then, he set the course. Because Darth Vader had just killed an emperor, and the galaxy was going to need a new one. What was waiting for him on Exegol was so much larger than either of them had ever let him know. The approach to Exegol was unlike anything in Vader's experience, and Vader had seen everything. The atmospheric interference alone would have destroyed a standard Imperial shuttle 3 times over. Magnetic storms that churned the upper cloud layers into a permanent wall of violence. Lightning strikes that hit with the frequency and force of an orbital bombardment. Gravitational shears that made every automated navigation system simply give up. Vader flew it manually. Through pain, through a suit running on emergency reserves, through the kind of focused darkness that had carried him through worse moments than this. He broke through the lower cloud layer and stopped breathing entirely. Below him, stretching from horizon to horizon across a dead world that no living creature had walked in 1,000 years, was a fleet so enormous that his mind required several full seconds to actually process its scale. Star destroyers, thousands of them, lined up in formations so precise and so vast that they looked less like ships and more like the teeth of something geological. Something that had been growing down here in the dark for decades, while the rest of the galaxy had no idea it existed. He landed in the primary command structure at the center of it all. Walked through corridors staffed by technicians who had spent their entire careers preparing this fleet for an activation order that had now never come, because the man who was supposed to give it was currently at the bottom of a reactor shaft on a debris field circling Endor. They looked at Vader the way people look at something they have been told to expect, but never quite believed would actually arrive. He walked past all of them without a word. The command throne was at the top of the central spire. Ancient, built from dark stone that predated the Empire by centuries, surrounded by systems and screens and tactical displays showing the full operational readiness of every single ship in the fleet below. Vader stood before it for a long moment. He thought about Palpatine. About 20 years of service to a man who had been sitting on this secret the entire time, who had kept him fighting for an empire that was never the real power base, never the real plan, never anything more than a visible distraction, while the actual weapon waited down here in the dark. He thought about Luke, about the throne room, about the choice he had made. Then he sat down. The displays around him flickered to life one by one, recognizing a master. The final order had its emperor, and this one had no intention of hiding. The engineers expected a figurehead. That was the honest truth of what they had prepared for. Palpatine's contingency plans had always positioned the Exegol command structure around a central authority figure who would inspire loyalty, project power, and leave the actual operational decisions to the systems and specialists already in place. Vader dismantled that model in the first 48 hours. He had the senior command staff assembled in the main operations hall and walked them through a restructuring so complete and so fast that 3 of them had to be replaced before the first day was finished. Not executed, simply reassigned to roles that matched their actual capabilities rather than their ceremonial ones. Vader had no patience for ceremony. He had patience for results. The fleet was extraordinary. That much he acknowledged without hesitation. Palpatine's engineers had spent decades building star destroyers that made the standard Imperial model look like a prototype. Larger, more heavily armed, each one carrying enough firepower to crack a planetary surface from high orbit without a second pass. But the command structure was bloated. The deployment protocols were outdated. The tactical planning had been written by people who assumed the fleet would be used as a threat rather than actually launched, which meant it had been optimized for intimidation rather than warfare. Vader rewrote all of it. He worked 18-hour cycles for the first 2 weeks, barely sleeping, running on the particular fuel of someone who had just discovered that everything they thought they were fighting for was a fraction of what actually existed, and who intended to make full use of the remainder. The suit was repaired by Exegol's own engineering division, using components that made the original Imperial construction look crude. His breathing steadied. His strength returned. By the end of the first month, he moved through the command structure like something that had been born there. Word began spreading. Carefully, quietly, through the Imperial remnant networks that had gone dark after Endor. Officers and commanders who had scattered across the outer rim, waiting for something to rally behind. One by one, encrypted signals found them. The Empire was not finished. It had simply changed addresses. Come to Exegol. On Coruscant, the New Republic celebrated its victory with a confidence that would have been appropriate if the thing they had defeated was actually the whole story. It wasn't. 200 light-years away, in the atmosphere of a dead world, a fleet large enough to end the New Republic before breakfast finished its final systems check, and its commander was already deciding which planet to visit first. The transmission went out on a private channel that only one person in the galaxy had the receiver frequency for. Vader had built it himself. Years ago. Long before Endor. Long before he even fully admitted to himself why he was doing it. A private line to a son he wasn't supposed to have. Maintained in secret from an emperor who would have used that connection as a weapon the moment he discovered it. Luke received it 3 days after the celebration on Endor. He came alone. That was the condition Vader had set, and the condition Luke honored, not out of compliance, but out of the same quiet certainty he brought to every decision he made. He landed on Exegol in a ship so small against the scale of the fleet surrounding it that it looked almost absurd. Vader met him in the command spire. Not the throne room, a smaller chamber, deliberately chosen. Whatever this conversation was going to be, it wasn't going to be a demonstration of power. He had enough of that. This was something else. Luke walked in and looked around the chamber once, then looked at his father with those steady eyes that had stared down the Emperor himself without blinking. "You could leave all of this," Luke said. Not accusatory, just direct, the way Luke said everything. "I could," Vader agreed. "Or you could stay, rule beside me, not as Palpatine's vision, as something new, something we build." The silence that followed was long and honest. "This isn't new," Luke said quietly. "This is the same thing with a different name on the door." Vader looked at his son for a long moment. The argument he had prepared, the logic, the scale, the genuine belief that order imposed at sufficient strength eventually became peace. All of it was there, organized and ready. Luke wasn't going to be moved by it. He had known that before the transmission went out. He had sent it anyway, because not trying was something he was no longer willing to do. "Then we are on different sides," Vader said. "We don't have to be," Luke said. "But we are." He left the way he came, alone, unhurried, walking back through a hangar full of the most powerful warships in the galaxy, like a man who had already decided what came next and was simply giving his father the courtesy of a last conversation first. Vader stood at the viewport and watched his son's ship disappear into the storm above Exegol. And then he turned back to his fleet and gave the order to move. The first sign was a convoy. A New Republic patrol intercepted it in the Outer Rim, 12 supply freighters running without standard transponder signals, carrying enough fuel cells and weapons components to stock a mid-sized military campaign. The escort was Imperial, professional, organized in a formation that didn't match any known Imperial remnant tactical pattern. The patrol engaged. The escort destroyed them in under 4 minutes. That was the part that landed on Admiral Akbar's desk the following morning and refused to leave quietly. Imperial remnant forces didn't fight like that anymore. They fought like people who had lost and knew it. Desperate, disorganized, running on leftover doctrine and fading morale. This convoy escort had fought like people who answered to something that was very much still standing. Luke brought the intelligence to the Resistance Council himself. He didn't tell them about the transmission, about Exegol, about the conversation he had already had with the man at the center of all of it. He told them what he knew tactically, which was enough to make every person in that room go very quiet, very fast. A scouting team was assembled within the week. 3 ships, best pilots available, in and out, confirm or deny the rumors, and come home with sensor data. 2 ships came back. The footage they carried was played once in the council chamber, and then immediately classified at the highest available level. Not because the information needed to be hidden, but because the people watching it needed a moment to process what they were seeing before it became public knowledge. A fleet. Exegol. Fully operational, fully crewed, moving through final deployment preparations with the calm efficiency of something that had been ready for a long time and was simply waiting for the right moment. And at the top of the command spire, visible for exactly 3 seconds in the sensor sweep before the surviving scouts had to run, a figure in black armor standing at a viewport looking out over it all. The council chamber was silent for a very long time after the footage ended. Leia sat completely still, processing. Her eyes had the particular quality they got when she was feeling something enormous and choosing, deliberately, professionally, to convert it into action rather than emotion. "He's not consolidating," she said quietly. "He's not rebuilding the Empire." She paused. "He's replacing it." Nobody disagreed. The question that followed, the one that nobody in that room had a clean answer for, sat in the silence like a stone. How do you stop something that makes the Death Star look like a rehearsal? It started with the symbols. Ancient Sith markings covered every surface of the Exegol command structure, carved deep into stone walls, etched into the floors of the command spire, worked into the design of every doorframe and corridor junction, with the particular obsessive detail of someone who wanted the people walking through these spaces to feel something specific at all times. Submission, reverence, the permanent awareness of standing inside something older and greater than themselves. Vader had spent 20 years inside exactly that feeling. He recognized it immediately, and he was done with it. The removal teams worked for 6 days straight. Every symbol, every inscription, every piece of Sith iconography that Palpatine had embedded into the physical structure of the facility was stripped, ground down, or covered over with something that carried no meaning except function. The engineers thought he was being symbolic. They were wrong. He was being precise. Palpatine had built Exegol as an extension of himself, a place designed to project his specific vision of what the dark side meant and who it answered to. Every person who served here had been shaped by that environment in ways they probably didn't even notice anymore. Vader had watched Palpatine use architecture the same way other commanders used propaganda, slowly, constantly, invisibly. He replaced the symbols with tactical displays, operational schematics, fleet formation maps that covered the walls of the command spire from floor to ceiling in clean, functional detail. The space stopped feeling like a temple and started feeling like a war room. Then he turned to the command structure itself. Palpatine's Exegol hierarchy had been built around loyalty to a single point: the Emperor, his voice, his vision, his continuation. Every rank, every protocol, every decision pathway led back to one source. Vader rebuilt it around capability. Officers were ranked by demonstrated tactical performance rather than tenure or personal loyalty. Decision authority was pushed downward into the command structure so that the fleet could operate at full effectiveness without waiting for direction from the top on every engagement. He was not building a cult. He was building a military. The difference mattered. Palpatine's followers served out of fear and devotion, brittle foundations that collapsed the moment the source was removed. Vader's commanders served because the structure rewarded competence and punished incompetence with an even-handedness that the old Empire had never managed. Within 8 weeks, the fleet moved with a precision and responsiveness that its original designers had never anticipated. On Coruscant, the New Republic intelligence teams updated their threat assessments for the 3rd time in 2 months. Each update was worse than the last. Leia told him not to go, not as a general, not as a council leader, as a sister, sitting across from him in a quiet room away from the briefings and the battle plans and the weight of everything that was coming, telling him with the particular honesty that only someone who shared his blood could deliver. "He made his choice," she said, "on Endor, and again when he sent that transmission. He knows where you stand. He chose the throne anyway." "He chose it because he thinks it's the only option left," Luke said. Maybe it is. It wasn't on the Death Star. The silence between them held everything that conversation couldn't carry. Leia looked at her brother for a long moment, at the absolute, unshakable certainty in his face that she had never fully understood and had stopped trying to argue with years ago. She let him go. He infiltrated Exegol the same way he did everything. Not with force, not with an army, but with the quiet precision of someone who understood that the most direct route and the most visible route were rarely the same thing. He moved through the outer fleet perimeter during a scheduled maintenance rotation, descended through the atmosphere in a configuration that read as debris on standard Imperial sensors, landed 3 kilometers from the command structure in the dead rock landscape, and walked the rest of the way on foot. The command spire was heavily guarded. He went through it anyway. He found Vader in the upper operations chamber, alone as he often was in the late cycle hours, standing before the vast tactical display that covered the entire far wall. The fleet, the deployment corridors, the target systems laid out in cold, strategic detail. Vader turned before Luke spoke. He had felt him coming since the outer perimeter. "You came back," Vader said. "I said we didn't have to be on different sides," Luke said. "I meant it." Vader looked at his son, at the face that carried Padmé's eyes and Anakin's stubbornness in equal measure, at the absolute refusal to give up on someone that most of the galaxy had written off as unrecoverable 20 years ago. The tactical display hummed quietly behind him. Thousands of ships. Enough power to end the argument before it started. "You cannot reach me with hope, Luke," he said. "I am past it." "No," Luke said quietly. "You're not." He reached out, not with his hand, not with the Force, just with the truth. "I felt you choose me over him. I was there. I remember." The room was completely still, and somewhere behind the mask, something that had survived everything, listened. The Resistance fleet dropped out of hyperspace above Exegol at exactly the moment Luke had calculated it would. He had planned for that, timed his infiltration around it deliberately, not as an escape route. He hadn't come here planning to escape, but because he knew his father well enough to understand that when the moment of choice arrived, it needed to arrive with full clarity. No comfortable middle ground, no option to simply wait and decide later. The tactical display behind Vader lit up with contact signals the moment the Resistance ships cleared hyperspace. Hundreds of them. Everything the New Republic and the Resistance had been able to scrape together and point in one direction. Brave, determined, and completely outmatched by what was waiting for them in the dark below the clouds. Vader looked at the display for a long moment, then looked at Luke. "Give the order," Luke said quietly. "Or don't. But decide who you are first." The operations chamber was silent except for the hum of systems and the distant rumble of a fleet preparing to engage on command. Vader turned back to the display. All of it laid out in perfect tactical detail. The Resistance formation, the final order response vectors, the engagement timeline that ended in one direction and one direction only. He had built this, shaped it, made it sharper and faster and more capable than anything Palpatine had ever managed. And standing there in the cold light of it, with his son behind him and a fleet above him full of people willing to die for the same belief Luke had just spoken out loud, he felt something he had not expected to feel in this room. Tired. Not physically, not tactically, something deeper than both. The particular exhaustion of a man who has been fighting so long in one direction that he stopped remembering what he was fighting toward, and just kept moving, because stopping meant feeling everything he had buried to keep going. He thought about Padme, about a boy from Tatooine who believed he could save everyone he loved if he was just strong enough. About every choice that had felt necessary at the time and monstrous in memory. He thought about Luke standing behind him, refusing to give up on a man who had given up on himself 20 years ago. His hand moved to the command panel. The fleet commanders waited for the engagement order. It didn't come. Instead, a different signal. Fleet-wide, immediate stand down. Luke closed his eyes briefly. "Anakin," Vader said, and the word came from somewhere so deep it barely made it out. "I'm here," Luke said. The throne of Exegol sat empty, and for the first time in 20 years, the man who had been Darth Vader chose to walk away from power instead of toward it. And that is how one choice, one single moment on a dead world at the edge of the galaxy, changed everything. Palpatine built a fleet to rule forever. Vader claimed it, shaped it, sat on the throne. And then a boy from Tatooine walked through the storm, alone, and reminded the most powerful man in the galaxy that power was never the point. It never was. The Force works in ways none of us see coming, and that is exactly what makes it worth watching. If this timeline hit different, smash that like button and let us know down in the comments. Subscribe so you never miss the next What If, because trust us, it only gets bigger from here. And if you want more alternate timelines, the next one is already waiting for you. Just click the screen. This has been the Star Wars Galaxy. We will see you in the next one.